Today we're going to talk about gas piping, and this is gas piping related to a gas furnace for an HVAC professional. So we're not talking about any of the plumbing systems or any of the responsibility of the plumber. It's simply coming from this component right here. This is called a gas ball valve, also called a gas stop. And I like to say gas stop because this is where our responsibility stops. Beyond that is the plumber. Now this does vary by state, but my state doesn't allow us to go beyond this without a plumber's license, and that's great. I want to focus on just my furnace, leave everything from somebody else. Now this has another terminology called a gas cock. There are a lot of plumbing terms that are legitimate plumbing terms that we want to avoid using in front of the customer, and calling it a gas cock is one of those. It's a common terminology when it goes to supply house, but that's a word that I typically want to avoid. And it is simply a gas ball valve. It's simple. It's a simple connector, and all codes require some kind of a gas stop for the gas furnace within range. And we'll talk about codes at the very end of this video. It's a long, boring section of codes, but it's also very important that we're going to discuss. The next component we're going to talk is a gas flex. I've always called this a gas flex. Everybody I've known calls this a gas flex, but in reality it's called a CSST, and that stands for corrugated stainless steel tubing. And it is a flexible connector, but still if you move it too many times it can break and will break. So you want to keep this down. Now there's different codes about the length of this, but usually 6 feet is the max most anywhere. I like to want to use a piece that is short as possible. What's the minimum that I need? That's what I want to use. This connector is also very important because it has a flare type fitting, which makes it very similar to a union. Here we see this cone head on here, and it's also coned inside of here as well, so they connect together so that we can service a unit. We can turn the gas off, we can disconnect the piping, we can change the valves, whatever we need to work on, and then we can connect it back together. It's very important though on this fitting that we don't use any kind of sealant or anything else that actually cause it to leak and cause it to get into the flow. If you find that this fitting is leaking, you need to replace your CSST to make sure that you don't have any other problems with that. So very simple little thing. This also is considered a union. So a union is some way for it to disconnect or connect again. So let's talk quickly about a union. Here's an example of a union, and we unscrew a union. We also have very similar, this one's rusted up really bad, but it's a flare or conial type connector and allows us to connect or disconnect. Now most of the time I like to see my unions located outside of the gas furnace, as well as this gas flex or CSST. Some codes will allow it to be inside the furnace, but most people agree it's not the best location, as well as this gas flex. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail shortly. The next thing I want to talk about is this component right here. We have a T, and our gas literally has to change direction before it goes into our combination gas valve. That change of direction is very, very important because any of the sediments, any of the trash, dirt, anything that gets in this line that shouldn't be there will ideally fall down into this little leg right here. Now this component right here has a few different names. One is called a drip leg, another is called the dirt leg, another is called the sediment trap, and tons of different names around the country is what they call it. But it's very important because it's collecting any of the trash in that system before it gets to our very sensitive combination gas valve. These things can clog up very easily, as well as our orifices and our spuds. We want to make sure that we protect this. So this is a component that's doing that. Now this has to be at least 3 inches deep according to codes across the country. Now the question is, where do you measure from? Some people say it's from the bottom of this fitting to the bottom of this. Everybody has a different names for it. I like to make sure I use this piece of piping at least 3 inches long. That way I know that I'm safe. This particular one is 4 inches long, so it makes the length from here to here 5 inches. There's arguments over if that's necessary or not. Hey, I'd rather it be longer than code, because remember, code is a minimum requirements. Either way, it's to collect the trash inside of there. Me personally, I've never found one of these to be completely stopped up, but I have heard about that happening. So either way, it's to protect our combination gas valve, and it has to change direction in that flow. I've seen some people try to put the T here, and it really does no good. The gas flows across that opening so fast it carries the sediment straight through. This way the sediment has to change direction and it falls down inside of here. So that keeps us protected. Next I have a piece of pipe going all the way into my combination gas valve. So if I had the wall of my furnace, it's coming out through the wall of the furnace, and then I have all of my other fittings in there. So let's talk about some other methods of that and what's allowed and what's not allowed. First thing I want to talk about, we call this black pipe. Black pipe is allowed for gas piping pretty much everywhere. The question is whether or not you're allowed to use galvanized pipe. And there are some codes and some requirements that are allowing galvanized piping, and some codes in some local jurisdictions say it's absolutely not allowed whatsoever. The issue is not so much the natural gas, but the sulfur that's inside the gas, what gives it the smell, can actually eat away the coating on this. The galvanizing can turn to flakes, and those flakes can get up in our combination gas valve. So a good practice term is even here using black pipe, you're going to be safe even if there's galvanized piping coming in. Now, another question people have is, well, you can't connect galvanizing pipe to the black pipe because of electrolysis, and that's also true. But here we have this stainless steel connector, and stainless steel is a fantastic metal that doesn't react with other metals very much, so we can actually have galvanized piping here, if it's allowed by your local code, have my flex, and then still have my black piping inside. The reason I don't want to put the galvanizing here, because I don't personally want to take a chance on any of these flakes happening, getting up inside of my combination gas valve or my spuds and my orifices. Is it a possibility? Yes. Will it happen? I don't know. I don't want to take that chance. So again, best practices, the black pipe, galvanizing, maybe it's allowed in your area. That's between you and your local inspector and what you feel is going to be right or what your boss tells you to do. Another piping we're going to talk about is copper. Copper has been forever not allowed in gas piping, but really, if you get that into the codes, it has very strict requirements. It says how much of the chemical that's in there is going to eat this away, because natural gas itself isn't what eats away this copper. It's what they use for the odorant, the sulfur inside of there, and we'll get into that to the codes at the end. So I do not like to use copper piping for that. For propane, 100% allowed. For natural gas, it depends on how much of that coating is inside that gas to begin with. So most places do not allow copper piping inside the furnace or even on any natural gas to begin with. Again, check with your local codes. It's going to vary. And again, at the end of the video, we're going to cover some of those codes. So let's talk a little bit about vocabulary. This is a cap, this is a T, and this right here is called a nipple. So this would be a 3-inch black nipple. This particular one's a 4-inch black nipple. That's a proper terminology. You go to any hardware store, you'll see that terminology. However, you'll see a customer and they'll hear this term, what are you talking about saying these words in my house? And they can get very upset. So I just call it a piece of gas piping. Another term for longer pipes is a joint of pipe. That can also be offensive to some customers. So these are some of the words that we got to be careful on the residential side. Commercial, it's usually not an issue. Residential side, we have to be careful of what we say in front of that customer because perception can be reality. As we talk about this, we're going to have to put a type of sealant on these fittings, and it's not a sealant. It's actually called a pipe joint compound. It's not supposed to seal the threads. It's supposed to use it on there so they don't bond together. Now, this is pipe joint compound. Forever, I've called this pipe dope, and everybody I've known has called it pipe dope, and every hardware store knows it is pipe dope. Again, pipe dope can be offensive to the customer, so we look on the bottle, and actually this bottle doesn't say pipe dope on here anywhere, so I don't even know where that started from, but it's pipe joint compound. It's very difficult for me to learn these new vocabulary words. I've been saying it the other way for so long, but I overcome this. We call it pipe joint compound now. Another thing, let's talk about this pipe joint compound, is what's inside of it. This one has PTFE, which is essentially Teflon in it. I've used that for a very long time, never had issues with it, but I recently found out that some local jurisdictions do not allow any type of Teflon. It's not allowed to be used Teflon tape and not allowed to use Teflon even in their pipe joint compound. So this is because you got to check with your local codes. To simplify it, just simply use the pipe joint compound rated for gas that doesn't have any of the Teflon in it, and that way you're clear through all of the codes. So use a pipe joint compound without Teflon on the connections. You set this up coming out of the furnace like this is allowed for most places across the country. As we talk about using this substance, this is a very important part, and this is the reason I really made the first video to begin with, is when you're applying it to the threads, you want to make sure you apply it 2 threads from the end. As I apply this around here, 2 threads from the end, and this is all gloved up, it's going to make a mess. And the reason 2 threads from the end is so that we don't get our pipe joint compound inside of the pipe, because then it's going to flow and clog up our combination gas valve. So no matter how much you try to put it 2 threads from the end, you'll see that you'll still get pipe joint compound 1 or 2 threads from the end. So that's why we use the 2-thread rule to keep it from the end. Now as we thread this on, we want to make sure we wipe off the excess, maybe leave a little bit of a bead around there. We want to wipe off this excess because it's going to get everywhere. All your tools, you'll make sure you clean them after you do any gas work because this ends up on your shirts, on your clothes. For some people that may not be an issue, but you got to think we have to have the image in front of the customer, the professionalism in front of the customer. So if you end up with pipe joint compound on your clothes, it never comes off and your clothes start looking grungy and the customer starts seeing you as not a professional. Many times, I'm not talking about whether they should or shouldn't view it that way. It's irrelevant of what perception can be. So we want to make sure that we keep that looking nice, keep the system clean, and also so the next guy working on it doesn't get pipe joint compound all over him as well. So now we've covered those sections. Let's talk about a few things you cannot have, and this is pretty much everywhere across the country. Everybody agrees that you're not allowed to have a bushing. So this is a reducing bushing. I cannot use this. However, we can use a bell adapter. So this bell adapter goes from a larger size to a smaller size. I've had nobody get upset about a bell adapter yet, but a bell adapter is used to change sizes. I don't know the reason that this isn't allowed. I think it has something to do with the amount of material in there. Maybe they're cracking, I'm not sure, but a bell adapter is what we use. Now this one I would not use. This is horrible. It's rusted up, and actually what happened to this was it had coil cleaner in the service fan spill into the bottom of this and it rusted this up. That's a very important thing. I've seen some people just clean them up and use them, but inside is what's important. We don't want any of this dirt ending up in our very fragile combination gas valve. So we make sure that we keep these clean and in very good condition, and if they're like this, throw them away, get rid of them. We don't need them around. Go to the supply house, get you some new ones, and make sure that when you have it in your bin in the truck, it has some kind of a lid on it so they don't rust out, so they don't get moisture in there, so they don't get anything else in there that's causing them to clog up, because we want to keep this line clean and flowing good all the time. It's also important that we check all of these fittings, whether we're doing installation, service, or repair. We want to make sure none of these fittings leak when we leave that customer's house. We can use a type of gas leak detector, which is a type of bubbles that we put around all these fittings, and we look to see if it's bubbling up. Some manufacturers have specifically said not to use soap because soap can cause corrosion. I didn't know that until I read the manufacturer book, and that was quite interesting to me. So now I make sure that I use that, or personally what I prefer is a digital gas sniffer. We turn this on, it has a warm-up sequence through it. We can calibrate it on the side, and I have this running usually the whole time I'm working to make sure I'm not leaking gas, and we go over all of these connectors right here to make sure it's not leaking. It'll actually smell for the gas and sound off. That's a good way of doing it. It's not recommended to use a lighter. I've seen guys put a lighter around there. But what happens when you have a large gas leak? I don't want to take that risk. I don't want to have a flame going out there when I don't have to. So if you're working with somebody that's doing that, don't argue with the senior technician that's doing things, but keep those things in mind. There's other ways of doing it that are safer and easier to work with. So let's talk about connecting these pipes. I have this pipe going into this combination gas valve, which is aluminum. So a lot of times you'll see guys tightening these up and they actually crack this combination gas valve. So you want to make sure we don't over tighten these fittings. This particular model is really nice because they leave us this cast square in, and we can use our adjustable wrench, and we can put our adjustable wrench on that fitting. Now we can use our pipe wrench on here as well, and we can tighten these fittings up. So you always want to have a wrench and a backup wrench. If I'm using fittings such as this, I have my wrench and my backup wrench. You want to make sure on your wrench that you're using that you clean this up after you're using it. This will eventually get clogged completely up, and that will cause it not to get a good bite on it. So keeping these in good shape, keeping them clean, keeps your clothes clean, keeps your tools lasting longer. In the old days, we used to actually take a file and sharpen these up so they could get a good bite on them. You want to make sure you use a good brand of these. I found that the cheap ones use cheap metal here, and they start to round off. Also, I like to have a larger one and a smaller one to get in some of the smaller areas of the gas furnace. So this is the majority of everything we need to know for the gas piping. From this part on, I leave that to the plumber. Sizing, I can teach sizing. I've done sizing. I don't like to do that. I prefer handling just this section right here. Now, another thing different between the plumbers and us is a lot of times you'll have a plumber coming out, sometimes it's an apprentice, and he's sent out to do the pressure test. You want to make sure that this gas stop is off for any type of gas pressure testing. I even like to take, if I know they're going to do gas testing or if it's a new construction, I unscrew our corrugated stainless steel connector so that I don't have to worry about them losing and damaging it, because this combination gas valve is only rated to have up to 13 inches of water column, which is a fraction of a PSI. they'll test gas pressure at several psi, and that high pressure will damage the diaphragms inside this combination gas valve and ruin these valves. It can cause overfiring. It can cause issues not being able to adjust the gas pressure. It has issues with this leaking after it's been shut off. There's a lot of issues with having too much pressure coming into this combination gas valve. So if they're pressure testing, this needs to be off. I like to disconnect the unit to make sure it's not going to damage my combination gas valve. So next I want to talk a little bit about codes. So when we're talking about codes, this gets tricky because codes vary across the country and your local inspector's interpretation of the code varies across the country. The first time we did this video, I had some wonderful people come in and give me information about the fact that galvanized piping is allowed in certain areas. So you need to check with your local inspector and your local codes because that's going to trump anything that I say. On top of that, you usually go with whatever's the most stringent. So if you have two codes that are contradicting each other, whichever one is the most stringent or the one that's considered to be the most safe is the one you go with. Sometimes the local code is much more strict than it is for the state code or the national code. So whichever one's more strict is the one you follow. And also the installation manual of the furnace will have its own codes, what's allowed and what's not allowed. So you got to go what's the safest. That's what we want to follow. This part's going to be a little bit dry. We're going to cover some codes. The first code we're going to talk about is the IFGC, which is the International Fuel Gas Code. This has been adopted by 41 states. So even though that big code's only been adopted in 41 states, it's still considered a good reference, but not everywhere. It's also been adopted by the District of Columbia, Guam, Puerto Rico, and New York City. So we're going to start off with gas codes 9.6.1.1, and it says connectors and tubing shall be installed to be protected against physical and thermal damage. 9.6.1, number 5, CSST shall not be routed directly into a metallic appliance enclosure where the appliance is connected to a metal vent that terminates above the roofline. Cancel. Next, we'll talk about codes, and codes vary throughout the country as well as some vocabulary words. But as we talk about codes throughout the country, I want you to understand that you need to check your local code with your local inspector because what your local inspector says is going to be very important. You want to have a good rapport with him, want to make sure you don't argue with him, but you can ask him why. Can you show me this? And most of the time, they're pretty willing to show you and teach you things. So as we talk about codes, I did this video once before and had some great viewers come in and give me information, some discrepancies such as the fact of galvanized piping is allowed in some areas now, some discrepancies of what is and isn't allowed in codes. So I didn't find any codes that was standard throughout the entire country. The most common is the IFGC, which is the International Fuel Gas Code. It's been adopted by 41 states, including the District of Columbia, Guam, and Puerto Rico, as well as the city of New York. So as we did that last video, I had to go do some research. I did a poll on the HVAC school group and found there was a variance of codes and what people were allowed throughout the country, including Canada. So I appreciate everybody giving me that information, as well as I want to give a special thanks to Mr. Carter, who wrote the books for AHRI Fundamentals of HVACR. Carter's a good friend of mine, and he's always there when I have questions and things I don't personally understand. He's been really good, and he went through and looked up all the codes related for this video to make sure that I was going to be on point. So big shout out to Carter for coming in again. And no matter what you know, there's always somebody else that knows more. Never stop learning. So even though this was going to be a quick video for gas, it ended up being much longer. I'm going to go through those codes now that Carter found for me, and we're going to point those out. And it's going to be a little bit dry. I'm also going to put this in the information below the video so you guys can look these up, but find out what's in your local area. What is allowed in your area and what's not allowed. So we're going to go through this. Thanks, Carter, again. We're going to start out with the International Fuel Gas Code number 9.6.1.1. And it says connectors and tubing shall be installed to be protected against physical and thermal damage. 9.6.1, number 5, CSST shall not be routed directly into a metallic appliance enclosure where the appliance is connected to a metallic vent that terminates above the roofline. So this is another reason why I don't like to have this inside of the furnace, because most 80% gas furnaces have that metal flue going above the roofline. 9.6.1.2 shall not be installed through an opening of an appliance housing, cabinet, or casing unless the tubing or connector is protected against damage. So this tubing, if it's going into the housing, has to be connected where it goes through the metal hole and as well as protected from the flames from any rollouts, from any electrical. I have even seen units where we had the wiring rub against this, short out, and blew a hole into this tubing. So these are some of the reasons why I don't like to see this in there, even if you can argue for it and get away with it. It's much safer to have this on the outside, and that's why I have this listed as best practices. If your local code allows that and you're okay with that, then that's your choice. As we continue on through this list of codes, number 9.6.5, each appliance connected to a piping system shall have an accessible, approved manual shutoff valve, which is we have here. 9.6.5.1a, where a connector is used, the valve shall be installed upstream of the connector. So we are upstream of the connector. A union or flange connector shall be provided downstream of the valve. So here's our valve. Downstream of the valve, we must have a union, which is this, or a flange connector. So this CSST doubles it because it's a flange connector. It does allow for that in our code. Number 9.6.8, a sediment trap shall be installed downstream of the appliance shutoff valve as close to the inlet of the appliance as practical. The ICC gas code, number 409.5.1, says the shutoff valve will be located in the same room as the appliance. The shutoff valve will be within 6 feet of the appliance. Number 411.1, number 3, semi-rigid metallic tubing shall not enter a motor-operated appliance through an unprotected knockout opening. Number 411.1.3.3, connectors shall not be concealed within or extended through walls, floor, partition, ceilings, or appliance housings. International Residential Gas Code, G2414.5.2, copper and brass copper alloy tubing shall not be used if the gas contains more than an average of 0.3 grams of hydrogen sulfide per 100 standard cubic feet of gas, or 0.7 milligrams per 100 liters. And also G2422.1.4, a union fitting shall be provided for appliance connected by rigid metallic pipe, such as unions shall be accessible and located within 6 feet of the appliance. So there's our codes. Read them for yourself. Find out what your local codes are. Make sure you're applying this. But I haven't found that this system right here to be disallowed anywhere across the country. It's a nice, simple system. Even if you have galvanizing pipe on this side, the stainless steel connectors prevent those two pipes from having electrolysis. We have the metal piping here. We don't have to worry about anything contaminating our combination gas valve. We have our sediment trap that's close as possible to the furnace. It's a nice, simple system. And whatever you do, make sure that you do it with pride. And never stop learning. Keep learning, always learning.